Hello, everyone. Today, I'm so excited to introduce Isabelle Schipper, an artist who makes paintings and here I'm ripping on something that My Pet Ram Gallery posted on Instagram, paintings that team with signs and symbols of femininity and community, and play with the lines between painting and drawing, abstraction and figuration, flatness and depth, bodies and the spaces they occupy. Isabelle's work has been exhibited at Automat Gallery in Philadelphia, Mackland Avenue Studio in St. Louis, Missouri, White Columns here in New York City, New Collectors Gallery in New York, a couple shows there, Studio 9D in New York, Mantle Art Space in San Antonio, Anna Zarina Gallery in New York, and Bryan Gallery in Philadelphia, the International Print Center in New York, FMC Tower in Philadelphia, Gallery 8 in Philly, School of Fine Arts Gallery in Philadelphia, Cade Gallery in Arnold, Maryland, St. Charles Projects in Baltimore, and Fox 2 Gallery, also in Baltimore. In 2018, Isabelle collaborated with Small Editions to print and publish the risograph zine Bikini Girls, originally exhibited at the New York Art Book Fair at MoMA PS1. Bikini Girls is now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Ohio University, SUNY Purchase, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University, University of Michigan, and Virginia Commonwealth University. Isabelle received an MFA from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art. She also studied at the Studio Art Center's International in Florence, Italy. Please give me a warm welcome for Isabelle Schipper.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And thank you for all the students and friends who showed up today, and friends zooming in. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about my work, and it's been an honor to collaborate with Mark on this lecture series over the last 4 years. I'm very humbled to be in the company of many of the artists that we have had to speak here. Today, I'll be doing a bit of a deep dive into my life as an artist, going back about 10 years and taking you through several bodies of work up to the present. I'll be thinking about my relationship to painting, sharing references and ways of working developed over time. Hopefully you'll see the thread or at least be entertained. At the end, I'm going to spend some time talking about how to be an artist and how to practice. These slides are repurposed from a talk I gave for my friend Addison Nam Noom's Idea Lab class at the Moore College of Art and Design last October. Okay, diving in. Here I am at 17 years old, standing next to a painting by the Dutch Cobra artist Constant Nieuwenhuis. I'm sharing this because this is one of the first times that I can remember being in awe of painting. And this experience and many afterwards taught me the importance of going to see paintings in person. If you take nothing else away from this talk, my PSA is you have to see paintings in person. That's it. The next slide I'm going to share is a handwritten note from my father given to me when I was 17 and leaving for art school. The quote reads, "There is a time in every woman's education when she arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that she must take herself for better, for worse, as her portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to her, but through her toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to her to till." This is a feminized quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on self-reliance, and it's something that has come with me to every studio that I've had over the last decade. Just sort of talking about how the power is within you and you need only work to uncover it. I'm going to share a couple more slides before I actually dive into my work. These are two postcards. The top one is a painting by Juan Miro, and the bottom is a piece by Nan Goldin. And these are things that also have come with me to every studio that I have. What I like about them is that they're two completely different works by different artists made in different times. But if you kind of soften your gaze as you look at them, they read as essentially the same thing. So it's a way, thinking about a way of looking that is softening the gaze to find the essential form. This is something that feels very essential to my practice. Here's another kind of iteration of that. Pardon me, I'm gonna drink water as we go. This is a couple pages out of a book called Modern Primitives, Masters of Naive Painting, which is a book that I received after my German grandmother passed. It was part of a collection of books. And on the left is a painting called Girl Before the Mirror by Morris Hirschfeld, and on the right is a photo of my mother fixing her hair in the mirror. And again, it's a similar situation where they're two separate images made for different reasons at different times, but they evoke the same feeling. They're using the same kind of compositional elements. And also this speaks to like a practice of researching, collecting, finding, and putting together. And one more before I talk about my own work. On the left here is Albert Durer's print The Four Witches, and on the right is Pontormo's Visitation. Pontormo's Visitation is one of my favorite paintings ever. I got to see it when I was studying in Italy. And kind of the point of this one is there's speculation that Pontormo saw Durer's print. So the thing that's cool about this to me is like, even in the 16th century, artists were beat biting. They were looking at the work of other artists and being inspired and taking on their compositions and bringing them to the studio and making them their own. So this way of working, this way of like being a lover and appreciator of art history is like ancient, you know? And it makes me, it's sort of grounding to me to feel like I'm a part of that tradition. And yeah, the Pontormo one is just like so modern. The two figures are looking at each other, and then there's a double of the figures that are looking back out at the viewer. Just an amazing painting. Okay. So now I'm going to start us with a couple early works. You know, I'm going to be showing a lot of work, some of which is more successful, some of which is less successful. But the intent of which is to kind of give you a sense of a trajectory of my work over time. This is a photo that I did for my like, digital photo one class, probably my sophomore year of undergrad at MICA. And at this time, I'm like 20 years old. I've recently come out. I'm reading Laura Mulvey, John Berger, and Marianne Cause, and I'm thinking about the concept of the male gaze for the first time. I'm grappling with issues of objectification as a feminine presented body and person, and starting to grapple with the idea of like what representations of or depictions of women in media made for male consumption. So in this photo, I am sat next to and kind of cradling an inflatable sex doll, which are actually sold as love dolls. So I'm taking this object, which is like quite literally made for male consumption and sexualization, and showing it kind of tenderness and care. And here's another kind of self-portrait from around that time. This is me. Yes, I was blonde in college. I did dye half my hair pink and then the rest of it blonde, and then was blonde for a while, and now I'm red. But here, it's a painting of me, and on the wall behind me is a Sports Illustrated swimsuit calendar from 2015, and that page is Kate Upton. So again, like grappling with this idea and doing it in a fairly literal way. Like I would say that these questions of objectification are still central to my work, but they show up in a much more nuanced way now that I'm 30 and have been working with these ideas for a decade. You know, but we have love for her. And then this is another early work. This is sort of the start of my relationship to abstraction. I started to think about what if the body of a woman, the torso, was the canvas. And so it sort of becomes made up of these three triangles, which make up a bikini. And this is the start of that work. When I'm in Italy, I started making these. There's some more of those. Also just sharing, I'm kind of sharing references throughout in a kind of chronological way, things I was seeing. Here's another Pontormo that I got to see. This is in the Church of Santa Felicita in in Florence. And again, like incredible composition, incredibly contemporary work, use of color. Baltimore was a Mannerist, so it's sort of like later in the Renaissance. And my high Renaissance art history teacher used to refer to the forms as attenuated, which just means like the bodies are really elongated. Another show I saw while I was traveling around after studying in Italy was a show of Bupin Kakar at the Tate Modern. And you might not see the influence of this show up very literally in the rest of my work, but I wanted to include this because one, I think he's like not a super well-known artist. And two, it's just, yeah, the color is really fab, and I think it has been very influential. I'll just read a little bit about from a review of that show. The Tate exhibition opened with a series of narrative paintings in the vein of the one that had caught my attention in Delhi, all populated with figures drawn simply but neatly, with an almost childlike hand. The childlike hand becomes important later in my work. Mostly executed in and around the year 1970, these works at once conjured intricate Pahari miniatures, 14th century Sienese painting, playful primitivism of Henri Rousseau, and David Hockney's Egyptian works. Their color palette was rich with pastel pinks and moody blues and purples. Okay. So as I come back to Baltimore, again, sharing some more references, I'm looking at Cycladic figurines, Venus of Willendorf, ancient Egyptian fertility figurines. Again, these are like kind of ancient representations of women, sometimes made by women, other times made by men. And then thinking about how feminist artists in the 60s are kind of cannibalizing those ideas and recreating them on their own accord. And then I made these in my studio. So again, like taking things that I'm seeing, bringing them back to my studio, and then making them kind of through my own eye, through my own hand, through my own logic. These are little figurines I call Venus figurines. They're made of stuffed pantyhose. And looking at Picasso ceramics, these are interesting because it's like a woman becomes a vase to put flowers in. Again, a very literal idea of objectification and the sinister male gaze, but also, I just love these on a formal level. They're silly and whimsical and they really speak to me. So looking at those, also looking at this collaboration between Dali and Disney called Il Destino. It's worth looking at. I think it's like 12 minutes long, and it's a really bizarre piece of animation. And so from that, I'm making this series of screen prints. And we'll move on from there. And then in 2017, I saw several shows of work by women working in abstraction. One of them was an Agnes Martin show. Another one is the Carmen Herrera retrospective at the Whitney. Carmen Herrera got no recognition until she was like 90 to 100 years old. I think she might have been 100 when this retrospective happened, which is crazy and just again speaks to the way that we value women artists in history. And also I included Georgia O'Keeffe. You'll see why she's important later. We love her, obviously. So I come back and I start working through this series, which is called Bikini Girls. And these are some of those paintings. There you can see like a very literal one-to-one kind of reproduction of a Carmen Herrera, but through this lens of like, what if 3 triangles suggest a bikini, which suggests a torso, which suggests a woman trapped within the frame of a canvas. And this is some documentation from my senior thesis. And I think the language that I use, let's see if I have it in my notes. Okay, the line I remember from my elevator pitch is, queer body as landscape taking up space without apology, right? Which is like, we love that. I think it's like, I'm 21 years old, I'm recently out, I'm feeling my oats. And I'm needing to take up space in this way that's very, it's like very literal, but also playing with an abstraction and enjoying colored form. Again, here's another painting. This one was, and from now on, if you see an image like without caption, it's my work, and if there's a caption, it's somebody else's work. So here I'm referencing Courbet's L'Origine du Monde, and also I had seen the Matisse Diebenkorn at the BMA. So thinking about Diebenkorn's like sun-bleached landscapes. And here is another painting referencing Raphael's La Fornarina, or Portrait of a Young Woman. And throughout this time, I'm doing a lot of drawing in my sketchbook. Hey, Annabelle, studio mate just walked in. She's late, but we won't be mad at her. Thank you for being here, darling. Anyway, so throughout this painting practice, I'm doing a lot of drawing. The drawings are usually pretty fleshed out. Often they're kind of better than paintings because like drawings are always better than paintings. But I'm working through these. And we had some kind of like career fair or professional day or something like that. And at the professional fair, I met Corinna Reynolds, who at the time was the head of small editions. Now she's at the Center for Book Arts. And she suggested that we create a zine. So we created the zine, which then came out in 2018. Just run through some photos. I'll read a little bit. Here's my little blurb from that. Conceived in response to swimsuit calendars and beauty mags and stupid questions, Bikini Girls is about girls with lazy bellies and boobs liberated from their brasiers, and lovers looking at themselves and each other. It spreads and folds queer the traditionally straight medium of the men's magazine. Some titillate and arouse, some amuse, some unnerve, and some just exist. Cheeky, coy, and peekaboo-boo. You know, why not have some fun with it? I'm a salesman. Okay, so that is this, and it was really nice to kind of have this piece of printed matter that kind of encapsulates the work that I've been doing for like 4 years. Okay, how's everyone doing so far? So this is going faster than I thought. Great, yay. Okay, so while I was in my senior year at MICA, there was an open call for a juried exhibition, and through that, there was a possibility to win a scholarship to grad school, and I did. So I went to, yeah, pretty nice. So I didn't really know what I was going to do after undergrad, and then I was like, well, I guess I'm moving to Philly. So around this time, I'm seeing Helma Offland at the Guggenheim. Shout out to the Guggenheim, a lot of shout outs in this presentation. And I'm still thinking about kind of archetypal images of women. This is Artemis of Ephesus, which is like circa 6th century BCE. And some reads of her is that she has like lots of tits or like boobs all over her chest. Other reads are that they're bull testicles, which is like meant to be a sign of fertility. She's like a fertility goddess. And later on, she's associated with Agrippina, who's a Roman empress. I read a whole book on that last year and then lost the book, and I don't know where it went. Anyway, but so I'm thinking about that, taking this idea of like a many-breasted fertility figure, and I'm playing in my studio. I'm doing a lot of material play. I think when I got to grad school, I was like, well, I've been painting for quite a few years now. What else can I do? So I'm playing with material, I'm still drawing, I'm thinking about altarpieces and kind of monumental scale. This is a 4 by 8 foot panel. I'm dabbling in sculpture, which I like to dabble in, but I don't really like making because it's too much work. But this is like a kind of boob sculpture that also feels kind of lunar. Also at this time, I'm seeing the Carolee Schneemann retrospective at MoMA PS1. I'm seeing the Radical Women in Latin American Art show at the Brooklyn Museum, which is including works by folks like Anna Mendieta. So I'm thinking about body work. Thinking about putting my kind of becoming the subject of the work. So there's a whole bunch of images of that work which I won't share, but here's one where I buried myself in sand in a box that was made to my dimensions. And I like lay there for 20 minutes and I get out, and the showing of the work is the projection, and then the box with the imprint of my body left behind. I shortly after this strayed away from making work where my body was at the center. I have so much reverence and respect for performance artists and folks who do that, but I found it to be, you have to be incredibly vulnerable, and it was just like a little too wearing for me personally. But here's some drawings that are sort of related to that. I was thinking about, well, for one thing, my friend Addison, who also gets many shout outs in this presentation, and I was like helping me lug this box around everywhere and like lug bags of sand. So I was thinking about girls carrying the rectangle, and also thinking about like women carrying the weight of the frame, the weight of the male gaze, etc. And so there's still like paintings that are coming out around this time. Okay. Yeah, and then coming back to this image and more iterations of this. But in the summer between my first and second year of grad school, I went to Mexico City for the first time. And at the Frida Kahlo Museum, House and Museum, they had a collection of her ex voto paintings. Ex votos are kind of devotion, they're like folk art, they're made by common people, and they're devotional objects, often asking a saint for assistance or mercy or whatever. And I just think there's something really very attracted to the idea of art making, like the purity of intention of making an object like as a devotional object. I think there's something in there that feels very important to me and I come back to. And on my way home from Mexico City, on the plane, I made this drawing. I was kind of thinking about what it is to feel disembodied. So like the head is floating above the body and you're like watching yourself while feeling disembodied, all of these things. I should also note that I was going through a really serious period of depression when I was in grad school, which, you know, I look back at the amount of work that I made at that time and it amazes me. I was very high functioning depressive. Yeah, but so, you know, you can feel some of that here, I think. And this is like another iteration of that drawing, which becomes a painting. Other folks that I'm looking at around this time are Gertrude Abercrombie. There was a fantastic Gertrude Abercrombie show at Karma Gallery in 2018. I'm looking at Jan Schwenkmeyer's Alice, so it's like his version of Alice in Wonderland. He's a real freak, so if you haven't spent any time with him, I highly recommend. Conspirators of Pleasure is another film that Ken Tisa showed me in undergrad. Shout out to Ken Tisa. And also his wife, Ava Schwenkmeyer-Rova, was an incredible painter and did a lot of the posters for his paintings. I'm also looking at No Home Movie by Chantal Akerman. Chantal Akerman is really well known for Gentleman, but this is the last movie that she made before she died, and it is about her mother, who was a Holocaust survivor. And also, something else I should say about this time in my life is like right before in the summer in between my undergrad and graduate programs, my dad's mother died, my Oma Sabine. And then while I was in grad school, my mom's father got sick and died. And then my dad's father also died like a week before I graduated. So death is like very present in my life at this point. And also around this time, my aunt, Agnes, another shout out, started to compile a history of my Oma's time in hiding during the Second World War. And she had this because she had interviewed my grandmother in 1998. And so like she had these interviews and she started to flesh this out. I think the book did not get published until maybe 2022, but in 2018, I had access to, or I was given like a manuscript. So I was very inspired by that. And also around this time, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford is giving testimony to Congress that trigger warning, sexual assault, Brett Kavanaugh, who is now a Supreme Court Justice, sexually assaulted her when she was young, and I'm like watching that on TV. So I'm thinking a lot about bearing witness and giving testimony and about women's stories and women's histories and like matrilineal passing down and who gets to be the arbiter of those stories. So the grandmother that I didn't mention here is my grandmother Amelia. This is my mom's mother. And I never met her because my mom estranged from her at a young age. She was bipolar and schizophrenic in the 60s, which means at that time in the US, there wasn't great treatment for this kind of like mental illness. And so she passed away in 2010 and I never met her. None of my siblings ever met her, whatever. So she's this kind of figure where my mom would talk about her and say, oh, she was incredibly creative and stylish, and she had je ne sais quoi, and oh, Isabelle, you have some of those things. And so it's like there's this kind of mythical understanding of this woman, and I had very few actual artifacts from her. One of them was this photo on the left that was sitting on my bookshelf, and while my mom was staying with me, she was staying with me because my grandfather was sick in Cherry Hill, and so she would commute from there. I started to ask her about her mother. And part of that research process is, here's like a wax resist print I made. These are, I'll come back to those. And so for my thesis in grad school, hold on, I wrote this down earlier, so I'm just gonna read it. let's see, bear with me. I made, for my thesis, I made a 2-channel film. On the left is footage shot over the course of one day in which my mother and I went to her childhood home, the church where her parents got married, and I knew what church it was because one of the only things I could find about my grandmother was a newspaper clipping of her wedding announcement, and also her gravesite. So it's these 3 places shot in the present. And then on the right is footage of me kind of performing as the character or the ghost of my grandmother, and as well as sort of like embodying her myth, giving form to a memory I don't have. In some shots, I'm wearing her wedding dress, which is again is one of the few artifacts that I have. And there it is hanging on the line. And also shooting inside a dollhouse that my grandfather made, which is a replica of the childhood home. So like thinking about a dollhouse as like a site of play, a site of imagination, and sort of juxtaposing these images together. Yeah, what else do I want to tell you about that? Yeah, this was a really strange time in my life and obviously very heavy material to work with. Going back to this drawing, when I sort of got to a point where I was like, well, I think I have to interview my mother about her mother, because if I don't ask questions, like who is going to do it? And also like, what else am I in grad school for? Like, this is a really big, ambitious project. This is kind of a left from the ways of working that I had been working in. I think I have to do it. So I interviewed my mom about her mom, and she tells me a story about coming home from school one day when she's 5 years old, and her grandmother was dancing naked in the dining room, looking at herself in a hand mirror. And I had made this drawing like 3 to 6 months before I was told that story. So like a lot of porousness and awareness of like ghosts and yeah, embodying myth. And you know, again, it's like I'm still working with images of women, but I'm now referencing my own family history in that. I think I'll leave that there for now. And the full video is on my website. I think it's pretty good. You know, it's like I taught myself Premiere and learned how to edit in like 3 to 6 months. And I think maybe one day I'll return to some of that footage, but it felt like it needed to be made, and so I made it. Okay, so coming out of grad school, I moved to New York, and 6 months later, the pandemic started. And a year later, I think I got my first studio in New York. And at this time, you know, I felt pretty burnt out after going to 6 straight years of art school. And I was kind of wavering in my like belief that I needed to be an artist and really unsure if I should continue. And I had some very dear friends say, no, you're talented, you have to keep going. And I'm really grateful for those friends who kind of kept me on the track. And so this is one of the first paintings I made. Again, you know, you can see a little bit of depression in this painting, I would say. But it's like this face coming through the ether, coming through the waves. And it reminds me a little bit of this shot from Time Bandits. If anyone's never seen that, it's a 1984, 1981 Terry Gilliam film, and there's like a face that comes through that says, "Return to that." It didn't get included in this, but that's okay. And also, so I'm making that. I'm also kind of returning to a form of abstraction. This painting I actually made while I was still in grad school, but I was working with this motif of hourglasses, thinking about like women described as having an hourglass figure, but also just like enjoying color and form and shape, right? And a few more works from around that time. And then I saw, once again at the Guggenheim, the Alex Katz retrospective. And I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of his work, but I went to see the show and was really enamored with it. I love this painting, which is technically kind of representational, right? We're looking at the edge of a dock and then the light on the lake above it. But it's really playing with scale and monumentality in a really interesting way. And it also kind of could function as an abstraction. And then this painting, read my little note here. Okay. So something that I love, and probably why so many Guggenheim shows are included here, is that often, particularly with painting shows, they'll start with the earliest works down at the bottom, and as you spiral your way up, you get to mid-career, and then by the time you get to the top, the artist is in their 80s or 90s, and they've been painting for an entire lifetime. And the thing that's so beautiful about this is like, once, when you've been painting for an entire lifetime, there's a confidence in skill and an understanding of like, I mean, I cried looking at this painting, maybe you don't feel like it's so spectacular, maybe you do. But the thing is like, there's not one extra mark made. It is only what is absolutely essential to communicate or evoke the feeling that you're trying to, right? Like it takes so much confidence to not overwork a painting, to put in only what is absolutely necessary. And this idea of like, what is essential, simplicity, sparseness, pared downness, and the idea that like, everything should signify something. What does a mark need to do? What can it say? I think is very important to me, kind of on the whole. And also like just seeing a show of big faces, you'll see why that is important in a moment. Okay, so yeah, I'm working in New York for the first time, not in school, trying to maintain a studio practice, and I'm thinking like, well, I don't want to make the work I was making in grad school. I don't want to just keep making something because I should keep making it. Like, what the hell do I want to make? And I'm really like kind of swimming through this space looking for clarity. I went back to Mexico City, I think in 2022, for a dear friend's wedding, and I saw this beautiful object. This is what's called a cachetone or like a cherub head. You'll see a lot of them all over Mexico City and various parts of Mexico. And I just was like incredibly drawn to it. I love the way that the hair is like made out of this straw-like material. It's like this kind of grotesque carving. It's a carving of a face, and then like the eyebrows are painted on, and there's a beauty mark, and there's lipstick, and there's eyelashes painted on like in little vertical lines. But then also because it's a mask, there are holes for eyes which exist on top of, like above the eyes. So there's like a doubling of the gaze, thinking about makeup in terms of drag, in terms of painted faces. And so I just said, this is something I'm excited about. Let me follow it and investigate it and see where it leads. So it becomes a drawing, and then a little painting, and then a big painting. A lot of this painting and a lot of my work I'll often make with an underlayer of flash paint, which is an acrylic paint that's super duper matte. They use it for scene painting. It often has really nice pigmentation and luminosity. And then I'll often go over it in oil. Sometimes I want oil sticks for the kind of texture that they can give, the impasto mode of painting. And also there's like a richness and a depth to the color that you can get with oil that I don't think you can get with acrylic. But yeah, so I just dove in with these, looking at more of them, especially there's a lot of these ones which are doubled, which again, like mirroring, doubling, always something I'm thinking about. More direct, kind of fairly direct references, and I just kind of gave them, I don't know, like regular girl hair, so they weren't quite as cherub-like. And making these really scary paintings that are like quite confrontational, I would say. This is some other stuff that's going on in my studio. This was like a watercolor that was supposed to be a painting of, and then it was too tight, so I rubbed through it. And then this little figure starts to emerge in the middle. She'll come back later, playing around with fields, just doing a lot of playing in my studio. I think when I came back to my studio outside of school, I was like, why the hell am I doing this? Why have I been doing this since I was 16? Like I really needed to reconnect with the joy of painting. And I think for me that manifests as leaving a lot of room to play in the studio. So yeah, these are little 8x10s, and they're like a wedding portrait and a kind of version of the deposition. Starting to again play with like this kind of sgraffito drawing technique. More faces. Thinking about like a face behind a castle wall. Castle walls. This is one of my favorite objects in my studio. It's a little thing that I made out of a Heineken box. And little things that you make in your studio that aren't necessarily like the big work that's a part of the big show are so important. Like you gotta be making stuff that no one is ever gonna care about except for you. Because it's like that's how you get to the big, grandiose, important work, is by making all the little stuff that doesn't matter. Drawings from this time, again, pandemic, depression, political state. Another painting, this was like after a really long day in the studio where it's like, God, I just didn't do anything that I liked today. And this came out in about the last 45 minutes. And it's like, thinking about like, what if the drawing is the painting? So I'm drawing directly on a panel. I'm allowing for really expressive mark making. I really like the literalness of like the drip from the eye of like the idea of like running mascara. And then here the kind of girl form starts to come back. There's like another painting underneath this that felt way too tight, so I painted over it and painted these little dancing girls underneath, and then brought the face back on top of it, thinking about transparency and layering. And this is another one. I should also mention that like sometimes in my work, ideally we're all just inspired all the time and we have a vision and then we like make a work based on that vision. But sometimes you're not feeling inspired, and it's really important to find ways to keep your hands busy when you're not having a vision. Because sometimes your head is somewhere else and you have to keep your hands moving in order to like keep yourself going. But yeah, here's another kind of entity, which is like she's sort of part of the castle walls, her eye is part of the window, like maybe there's allegory going on here, there's like a deep sadness going on in the painting, another version of that motif. As you'll see, I often make like a lot of the same motif over and over again. There's like, it's part of the kind of investigative process. Again, here allowing for expressive mark and then kind of drawing into it. Another one of these faces with two sets of eyes. Another version of a drawing. Again, there's like a bad painting underneath here, and then I painted over it black and scratched through, thinking about I don't know what they're called, but those like things that you play with as a kid, they're like etch something, scratch art? Yeah, think about scratch art. Okay. Etch is, no, I think it's scratch art. But yeah, thinking about childlike modes of working and like childlike making, thinking about the kind of, there's like an essential truth to the way that like a child might make work or represent something. More drawings, lots of drawing. And so then last year in October, I was lucky to be included in a show called Lookout at Automat Gallery in Philly. Automat is a really excellent artist-run collective space. Show is curated by my dear friend Addison Mamnoon. Included works by myself and Bishop Bailey. So these are some install shots from that. Bishop's work are these woven pieces on the wall. And I'll read a little thing from the exhibition essay. How are we doing? Great. Good. In new paintings, rugs, and works on paper, Isabelle Schipper and Bishop complicate what is to be perceived, wittily exploring gender and how it is performed, embodied, and mythologized. Their artworks prompt a breakdown between subject and object, active and passive, watcher and watched. Both artists play in archetypes that would not only mark a person as one thing or another, but press them into an ideal form. Bishop queers and deconstructs mythic archetypes, turning gods into objects and objects into gods in the process. Isabelle Schipper works with constructions of femininity, makeup, dolls, arching mouth, and arching mouths. Lipsticked girls peep out from high towers. Sometimes they melt into the architecture itself, barricading themselves in and shutting spectators out. Schipper's paintings fix the viewer with a stare that sometimes weeps and sometimes tricks. I just have to say it is such a joy and honor to like have friends who are incredible writers write about your work. It's like, oh yeah, I am so smart, and like thank you for seeing that. Like it's really I'm very lucky to have many artist friends, writer friends, photographer friends, whatever. And it really helps to carry you through. And I was gonna bring this in, but maybe I'll bring it in next week. You can see it here to the left of where it says lookout. They made a kind of exhibition booklet that included a bunch of the drawings, because there's a lot of drawings and they can't be all on the walls, / I don't want to pay to frame them. And maybe I'll bring that in next week. Okay, so I think sort of as I'm coming up to this exhibition, I'm starting to grow weary of the faces, or just starting to feel like I've mined as much as I want to mine from them, and I'm starting to feel ready for a shift. Often in ways of working and a kind of cycle of working, there's like a period of time where it's like, I don't know what I want to make, and then it's like, okay, maybe this is what I want to make. And it's like, okay, I'm going to make this for a while, and then naturally there comes a point where it's like, I think I've mined it as much as possible, it's time to move on. And so I'm just gonna share a couple more references of things that I've seen over the last couple of years that I'm thinking about. This is like a supremacist work that I think is really great. It's a design for an auditorium. It's kind of like working with sort of Renaissance arch, but then it's like, what if Jesus on the cross was, you know, triangles and squares and like imbued with divine power? Like that's just great to me. This is from a really fantastic show of Indian court painting at Lardon Augustine from I think 2022. This is like less directly visible in the work, but I just think it's great, so I'm sharing it. It kind of does the thing with the collapsing of space and the mirroring, which you probably saw in some of the earlier works. This is a detail from the Pleasures of Dancing, the allegory of the church, 1365. I'm very into like old depictions of dancing. I saw this in the Santa Maria novella in Florence. And there's a painting that comes shortly after this that's like kind of a direct rip on the composition. I'm including Calder's Circus, which I believe is still on view at the Whitney. I love this work. I love the kind of sticks and spit quality of it. Like these are just little things that are made with kind of studio detritus. You know, we think of Calder as being someone who's you know, work is very grand and polished and it makes these big, beautiful kinetic sculptures, but here's a way that he's working that has so much silliness to it. This is a dollhouse of Sarah Roth. I just saw at the France Falls Museum from 1743. There's a couple of like really spectacular dollhouses that were being made around this time, and they're being made like with the materials that the house is made from. Again, dollhouses, dolls, sites of play and imagination, a sort of set stage, all very interesting to me. Thinking about the caryatids. Caryatids are columns that are in the form of a woman. So like, again, the form of a woman, but it's in this sort of utilitarian architecture space. The triadic ballet. I actually had a friend come to my studio recently and recommend this, and I was like, oh, that does look exactly like my work. I can't believe I haven't seen this before. So have friends to your studio, they might tell you something that you didn't know, but is like totally your work. I'm gonna open the second bottle of water, everybody hang in. Okay, so this piece was in the Automat show, but it kind of starts on this next body of work. I really liked, oh wait, actually I have an excerpt from my artist statement. Hold on, I'm gonna read it. Okay, recently, this query has led me to the symbol of a woman as a pictogram made up of a circle representing her head and a triangle representing her dress. You might find her on a sign outside the bathroom. I'm interested in the universal and immediate legibility of these two shapes as they create a glyph, and the immediate legibility of it as gender. I've been using this as a prompt for geometric and color field abstraction. So yeah, like I love this idea of, it's also kind of a bastardized abstraction, right? Because like that is representational. It is a figure. It is like a girl in space. But it's also a triangle and a circle inside of a rectangle. So it's like I can take that prompt and like iterate on it and work as though I'm doing, you know, Albert's color studies. And I think in this case, she becomes kind of like a mountain. She's sort of a monolith. She's in this landscape. Here's some of her sisters. Then thinking about it in groupings, more drawing that then becomes painting. The drawing is better than the painting, the painting is good. This is one that's a reference to this one. And this one is that might have random. This is a super weird painting where it's like the kind of after image of the castle from when I was dealing with the castles earlier on. And then I was like, oh, okay, what if they're skipping across the moat? And then I like cut out pieces of construction paper and put it directly on the panel. And then was like, oh, that looks good. Let me paint those on there sort of trompe l'oeil. I don't really know where this painting lives in the world of my work, but it's like, again, giving myself a lot of license to play and to like relearn what it means to paint. Here's a girl as a home, thinking about Louise Bourgeois, thinking about Audre Lorde and like women making a home. Here are three little chiclets of these girls. These paintings are like 5 by 7 inches each. And like the two that are green and pink could be kind of grouped as a diptych and again a color study. These are kind of also referencing like little forget what these objects are called, I'll come back to that. Here's a girl who like, here I'm thinking about even corn spades, and she's got like a heart behind her, which could also be angel wings. Here's another doubling or mirroring, two girls as a visitation, more color play. This is a larger instance of this work. This work is like 4 by 8, 7, 8 feet, somewhere in there. And sort of thinking about them in space, thinking about transparency, thinking about drawing and painting. And then now we're gonna come up to fairly, oh, we're doing so good. You guys, I'm killing it. I'm doing so good on time. I was so nervous. I got a lot of slides. Hang in there. Okay, so now we're coming up to like very recent 2025 things that are in my studio right now. This is just a really weird, cool thing that I found at the Antiquarian Art Book Fair. Incredibly cool thing that happens at the Park Ave Armory. And sometimes you know, like a book nerd friend who gets you in for free. You gotta make friends in this world. This is the funerary procession of Charles IV from 1740, and it's like a broadside, meaning like basically this is like merch from an event that would happen in 1740. And there's so much I love about it. I like that it's an infographic. I love the way the little characters kind of move through space. I don't really know what that's going to become in my studio, but just sharing some other weird thing I found that I love. Oh, I wrote something small down about this. Bear with me. Also recently, I've been thinking about things which are not considered abstract paintings, but are really good abstract paintings. So I saw a show of turn of the century game boards at the American Folk Art Museum. There's also been shows of that at Rico Maresca, and so these are some of those. Thinking about G-span quilters. This is one from Penny Petway. Thinking about like Moorish tile work. I saw some of this at the Alcazar and Alhambra in Spain. And again, wait, coming back to this. This is like another excerpt from my art statement. So from there, so it's like here, bear with me. Here I'm kind of thinking about like the this like pictogram, and it's like sometimes it's a sign or a symbol, sometimes it's kind of monolithic. And then I start to think about it as pattern. I was also very inspired by Michelle Grabner's talk that we had last year, and the way that she talked about like if you zoom in on something, it becomes abstract, it becomes pattern. And also this is kind of like a way to allow my girls to be in community, right? They're all holding hands, they all exist in space and in context with one another. And this is a painting that I made where I, again, was just like really allowing myself to play in the studio. I had been kind of like hitting a lot of dead ends and was like, okay, just stop putting pressure on it, just play around. And then I finished it and I was like, that's a good painting. Yeah, so it's like it's made by making the paper cutout and pasting it onto the panel and working in and out of that. And since then I've made a couple more of these. And this is kind of where my work is at right now. I think like this could scale up and become more, but I'm really excited about this as being like a new way of working. You know, it's like every couple months, every couple years, you gotta like find something that is new to you. There's not, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, but there's something that's new to you and exciting to you. And like, you know, especially if you've been working in one medium for a long time, you have to find ways to like become reinvested in that and become excited about it. Okay. Oh my God, we're almost there, you guys. All right. One more sip of water and then my closing slides. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to be an artist and have a practice. This is my fun little diagram. First off, you know, it's like a very logistical question. You have to have time and space. I threw a little Virginia Woolf quote in here. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. This also goes for non-women identified folks, but shout out to Virginia. She's so funny. She's so much funnier than anyone gives her credit for. And she's super smart. So this is literally having a space to work, which could be a studio. If you're using oil paints, it shouldn't be your apartment because those fumes aren't good for you. Figuring out how to pay for that studio. That's why I'm here. And then figuring out how to have enough time to be in that studio making your work. Because if you have a studio, and it's just a storage unit, that's not doing you anything. You gotta be there. You gotta show up. Okay, this next one, I'm tentatively calling it foundation, and I'm including a little quote from Jim Clark. Jim Clark is on faculty here at SBA and brought one of his classes to my studio last year, and I did a whole bunch of song and dance and spiel. And afterwards he said, I think if we threw you off of a cliff, you'd pick up a paintbrush. Pausing for laughter. Yeah, I was really heartened by that comment. And I think that there's some truth in that. So the idea foundation is kind of this idea of like, what is meaningful to me or what is meaningful to you? That's your archive, your toolbox, the things that you research and collect. It's a constellation of knowledge accumulated and cultivated over time. It's your visual tendencies, aesthetic preferences, cultural references, color sensibilities, conceptual frameworks. What are your twisted little personal proclivities? Got a lot of alliteration in the slide. Do that. Be obsessed, be a freak. I interrogate where you're coming from, your POV and positionality beyond identity. And that doesn't mean like identity is very much a part of it, but it's also like, what does it mean to grow up in New Canaan, Connecticut, in the early 2000s? Like, how does that create the person that I am today and influence it? It's about creating your own logic, which informs the way that you what you make and how you make it. And it's also studio detritus, like all that stuff that I was talking about. It's like the stuff that isn't the big painting, but that just accumulates in your studio. There's a lot of kindling in there. Those things can start fires in a really good way. And yeah, this idea of creating your own logic. So it's like you can be a beat fighter. That is a term from Missy Elliott, in case you weren't aware. That means like you can go out and see things and like them and reproduce them in your own studio. But over time, as you keep doing that, there's a lens with which you will make it. There's a way that you will speak it. There's a way that your hands work as you make it that makes it yours and not a copy of someone else's work. Okay. And then the last and most important thing that you need to like be an artist and have a practice is community, right? I got some friends in the room today. I got some studio mates in the room today. Shout out to you guys who make it so I can afford a studio and that I can like keep showing up and working. This is your most important resource. You have to make friends, like, period. If you have a lot of money, maybe you don't need to make friends, but the rest of us have got to make friends. And you have to share, and you have to look around at those people that are in the struggle with you, who are in the trenches with you, and support them. And don't be like, it's not always about, it's good to have idols, but it's not always about trying to climb the ladder and like push everybody else down along the way. It's about like, whose hand can I hold? Instead of looking up, remember to look to your left and right. If you have something to give it, and ask for help when you need it. That last one, that's hard. That's like just recently I'm getting there. But yeah, I mean, like I have had friends help me document my work, help me work on my website, help me write my artist statement. I've allowed friends to store their stuff in my studio when they're in between apartments. You know, like it's about like being able to sustain and carry on, especially in New York where it's very difficult to do so. I know I wish I had an ending quote, but I don't. So thank you so much. Let's take a break. We're gonna take a break for 15 and come back.
Thank you for your talk. I felt myself sort of breathe into freedom and feel like the mission would be more experimental in the studio. I've noticed that like the architecture of your paintings, or the style of your paintings, or even the medium of your paintings seems to migrate a lot, but your color palette follows you around. Can you talk about what color means to you and why? Like, do you have a realization that like these are the colors that I need to say what I want to say, and why they carry even if everything else changes?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, my use of color is fairly intuitive. And it comes from, I think I have to really credit some of my teachers. I took a lot of figurative painting classes in undergrad with a guy named Tony Shore. And painting from life really attuned my eye to seeing color and light and shadow. So I think that was a really great education. And then beyond that, like some credit to my parents. I grew up in a house where it was like we had rooms that were painted like a terracotta color and an orange and a yellow. And We had a red dining room, so it's a little bit like something I grew up with. And then also, yeah, just being obsessed with painting, the history of painting for a long time. Color is one of the few things that I'm snobby about. I, want to see more than like red means happy and blue means sad. Like I want to see like, is it a warm shade of red or a cool shade of red? And like, what does that do? Yeah, I don't know. I don't, it's not so cerebral. It's not something that I think about like, oh, these are only colors. These are the colors that I'm allowed to use. But as you can see, I certainly come back to similar palettes time and time again. And I like the freedom of being like, what if the painting is a rainbow? Because I'm white, so I like rainbows. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Hi, Isabel. Thank you for your time. I love your paintings. I have a question about your practice in general. I was wondering if working with minimal gestures and reduced forms, do you feel a sense of freedom within that, or do you ever feel constrained by the visual language that you've chosen?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is we're sort of talking about abstraction, right? Like I think that I showed some of the work at the beginning, these like self-portraits, which are figurative, and the work that I was making in grad school about my grandmother, it's very figural. And there's something quite literal that happens there that to me feels kind of confining. I think there's something in the reduction of form and the reduction of elements that allows for the viewer to kind of project their own feeling onto it. And I really appreciate that permissiveness. Yeah, I think and it's also like, I think it's really important that I made the work that I made in grad school where I was like dealing with the figure and putting my body in the middle of it. I think like making work that doesn't end up being your work is really important. And there's a lot of pressure when you're a young artist to like find what your signature is so that you can then become marketable. And I think that that is like a total kiss of death to an artistic practice. I think you have to like really give yourself a lot of leeway to play around. And then, 10 years in, you might settle and be like, okay, yeah, it's kind of color field geometric abstraction is where I want to live. But like, a little bastardized and with some more cheekiness and whimsy and humor. Yeah.
Hey, Isabel, thanks for the great talk. I really like when you had that painting of Alex Katz's and you talked about what is essential and what does the mark need to do and say. Do you, in your own practice, have any tips for us on how to not overwork a painting? And can you continue struggling with that?
That's a really tough one, this thing that we're talking about. Yeah, I guess what I would say is like, as you're working on individual pieces, don't try to get one painting to answer every single question that you have. Like I think it's really, and we talked about this a little bit in some of the talks earlier this semester, this idea of like trying to get paintings to answer really large scale like political questions, identity questions, all of those things. I think that like trying to pre-prescribe what you want a painting to do before you make it can be a real hindrance to the experimentation that needs to happen. So I think it's like being really present with what you're working with, and allowing it to sort of tell you when it's finished, and then being like, oh, I don't know if I got to this idea that I was really excited about, but then start that on the next painting. I also often have a lot of paintings and things that are happening at once in my studio. So it's like, okay, maybe it's not happening over here, but maybe it'll happen in this one. That really helps. And then also like, I really romanticize the idea of like a lifetime of being a painter. And I kind of like the idea that it's like, this level of confidence can only be gained by making your work over 100 years. So like, that's, I don't know, I sort of appreciate things which require patience in that way. And like, I used to get really scared when I would make a painting that I thought was the best painting I ever made, that like I was never going to make a good painting again. But I think if things are going well in your studio, like get that thing up and out and put it out there, and then in 6 months you should have a new favorite painting, yeah.
Thanks, Isabel. I love learning about your practice. I know you touched on this. Could you elaborate on how you find time to maintain a studio practice in a full-time job?
Yeah.
That's something I struggle with and continue to even just our class.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. As I was getting ready for this, and in general, I've been feeling a little bit like, oh, I'm really just not making as much work as I want to, and I feel like that most of the time. And it made me feel a lot better to look at the work I was making in grad school and be like, oh, when this is my full-time job, I'm making a lot of work, which is a nod to a lot. I know a lot of you also have jobs, but like while you're here, just be here as much as possible, because when you go out into the world and you have to like support yourself and pay rent and health insurance and all that, it becomes much harder. I find time, what I've also learned is like, I usually go to the studio every Tuesday after talks, and I try to go maybe also on Wednesday and Thursday, but I also have a social life, you know? And I have hobbies, and like going out dancing is very important to my well-being, and going to WNBA games is very important to my well-being and my identity as a lesbian in New York. What I'll say is like, and we'll make a basketball reference. Like people say basketball is a game of runs. I think that like it will ebb and flow with your life, with everything else that's going on in your life, and like trying to be patient and give yourself grace in those moments. So like, you know, over the summer was a good time for working and partying, but also working. But then, you know, in September I come back here, and I'm very grateful to be here and to work with all of you. But also sometimes when I leave here at the end of the day, it's like, oh, I just worked my 9 to 5 and I'm really tired and I don't have energy to be in the studio in a meaningful way. And I guess it's like a little bit of, I think it's like showing up is the most important thing. So I try to get myself into the studio with frequency, with regularity, no matter what. And most of the time when I'm in there, what I have capacity to work on is something that's small. Maybe it's a drawing, maybe it's a small painting, maybe it's just looking at things. A lot of times it's like reorganizing my studio. I'm doing that all the time. And I'm like, what is this for? But the other thing I'll say about that is just that when I went to grad school and I really played around with a lot of different mediums. And when I left grad school and tried to figure out how do I have a practice outside of an academic space, I came back to painting because I think it's kind of my primary language of making. So there's a lot of immediacy versus like if you're doing video work, film work, it requires a lot of production, it requires a lot of large scale thinking, which for me is difficult to execute when I'm carrying other things in my brain.
Okay, so you want to before we go to the next?
Yeah, jump in, Mark.
It's just that, as you guys know, everybody who works in MFA Fine Arts is an artist. Karina, Nelson, myself, and as you now know, Isabelle, you know, but, and unlike all other departments at SBA, we give all of our staff a studio day. So that helps a little, right?
Yeah.
And, I think that's important. And you guys, when you're out there in the workforce, especially when you're running the show someday and employing people, you could try to employ other artists and give them the latitude to have a preference.
Yeah, I have a lot of gratitude for Mark for that. Much appreciation.
Hi, Isabel.
Hey,
Thank you for your talk. I was really looking at the newest work that you've made with the girls dancing, the girls holding hands, and my personal favorite is the one in front of the castle. The weird one out.
Oh,
that-
yeah, the
that you
yellow
showed.
one.
Exactly. So, you've throughout your talk, you kind of read bits of literature, you quoted people starting with your father, and it feels like the way your work is nestled in text is important to you. So I was really thinking of this like new body of work and whether you were thinking of specific literary references, if you're reading something specific that is informing this work or accompanying it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In the last year, I've read a bunch of, I read Zombie by Audre Lorde, and that's just such a kick-ass piece of writing. It's a kind of autobiography, auto-mythography. In that she talks about, she talks about 2 women becoming a home, which kind of inspired this painting. I've read a fair bit of James Baldwin, which I don't think is showing up in my work. And with the castle work, I read a short story by someone named Jenny Diskey, and I had a quote in my old thing, I think there's something about this idea of like allegory or storytelling or fairy tales that feels important. I think this like idea of a childlike sense of imagination, a way of telling stories feels important. And yeah, I mean, I love language. And I try to take in as much as possible and pull out what feels grounding. I think like with the newest work, it's like I'm sort of back in a cultivating period. Obviously, it's like a pretty direct continuation from the work I made before, but I don't know if I have like calling card bits of text yet, but I appreciate your noticing of that and like the phrase nestling within the text. That's nice.
Hey Isabel.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna ask my classic question, which is what do you do while you paint? If you listen to music or you watch TV, and then if so, what are you doing? Thanks.
I really like to listen to music in the studio. My dream is to one day have a set of Klipschorns in the studio. These are really incredible speakers, which are not currently in the budget. I've been listening to Molecular Stocke's Ethio Peaks Volume 4, which I played for some of you guys when you came in for orientation. I'm listening to a lot of like Lil Kim and Missy Elliott. They're very important to me. Listening to Marina and the Diamonds. I'm listening to a friend of mine named Kyle Garner does a set called Free Tea at the Lot Radio, and I'll often put that on. And also like a lot of house music and a lot of beat boop music. I don't know. I am often listening to music in the studio. I find that like if it's a podcast or if it's a TV show, I'm like my attention is a little bit too drawn away. I really know I'm in the zone when I'm like painting and I have a hand behind my back for some reason and I'm like chefing and I get like really close to the painting and then back up. But there's that. And also I share a studio with two folks who are actually in this room. Shout out to Annabelle and Coy. And I've also noticed, especially if I'm coming from work, it's really helpful to like stop and have a conversation with a friend about their day and like check in, sort of reframe my brain and then get into working. Sometimes it's like you have to give yourself a moment of transition, which is helpful.
Hi Isabel, it's Lucia, right next to Wiley. I really enjoyed seeing the evolution of your work, especially after grad school. Something I think about a lot and something I'm wondering is I feel like you continue to push yourself a lot. I was wondering if you have any tips for continuing to like push yourself and like evolve as an artist when there's not a million people in your ear telling you like you should try this or you should do this. I know you mentioned the importance of community, but I was wondering if there's anything that you do like regularly that kind of helps you continue to push yourself, because it seems like you've grown a lot. I just really enjoyed seeing the evolution and your growth.
Yeah, things that I do to push myself. Well, like I said, when I left grad school, I felt incredibly burnt out. Because I was dealing with subject matter, which was like really emotionally heavy. I was also incredibly depressed at that time in my life. I've been in a lot of therapy, can't recommend enough. It's really worth it to like be happy and at peace. And I feel like at 30, I'm like happier than I've ever been in my life, which makes everything else easier. And it doesn't mean that there aren't hard days, but whatever. But so yeah, I was kind of on the brink of like, why am I even doing this? I don't even know if I want to be in the art world. And so at that time, I set the parameter like, let me just get in the studio and make things and remember why I love this and like why I derive joy from this. And then I was doing that for a couple of years, and then I had friends, and I kind of at that time, like when I first started working here, I wasn't quite claiming my status or identity as an artist. I was sort of feeling sheepish and like, well, I don't know. I got really stuck on this thing of like, well, if you're not making work, then are you an artist? Which is, being tied to productivity in our super capitalist society. It's really the kind of pressure that comes with that, I think, is really stifling to creativity. And so, yeah, kind of like giving myself a lot of space to play and to say like, well, at this point, I've been doing this for a long time, so I must know something. And not being worried about all that knowledge being immediately understood in every single thing that I make. And then beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think I am in this for the love of the game. Like I love this shit. I don't have a gallery right now. I'm making work as though a gallery is gonna come calling, and they should. But you know, like, you kind of gotta keep going, and really, like, you should only be in this world if you love it that much. Cause otherwise it's like, yeah, I would love, like, I don't know, a corporate salary. But that's just not in the cards, and it's not what I want, it's not what I'm driven by. So yeah, it's also like when you're not sure of what you're making or what you wanna make, making sure to go see lots of things, you know, and continue to be a voracious, like, consumer of other people's work, and to see what's going on, and to, like, find a way to make, even if it's not the work, make something, write something, sketch something. Yeah, I don't know, I mean, I appreciate you saying that I'm pushing myself. Like I said, I think I really like to go deep on an idea, and then after a while I get bored and it's time for the next thing. And again, only recently did I realize, it's like, well, I used to worry a lot about, like, making work that wouldn't look like my work. And now I'm like, well, who the hell else would have made this shit? You know, like, it's like, which is not to say that no one else could, but would someone else? And the last thing I'll say, which is sort of a tangential point to this, is just that I tend to try not to look at too many of my contemporaries, because it can be tricky if you're being inspired by people that are working in your same time. Like, the one time that I've ever been like, oh, I'm making work that looks a lot like what this other artist is doing, is when I was finishing up in undergrad, and I had made, like, work that was looking like this. And if you guys know the painter Loie Howell, she was very hot at the time. She shows the pace, and I sort of was looking at her work and was like, oh, she's kind of doing the thing that I'm doing, but doing it better, and, like, with a deeper kind of material investigation, etc. And that was, like, one of the few times I've been like, okay, it's time for me to take a hard left and, like, try to kind of record scratch, restart, and see where, if I come back to the same place, then it means I'm meant to be making this work. But if I'm not, then maybe it's something else. That's part of the reason why I look at a lot of folks who are much older. Because I feel like if I try to copy the work that they're making in the 16th century, it's not gonna come out the same, because I live in 2025 in New York, in this political climate, in this period of time. So all of that context will influence how the work comes out. Hi. Is the light green?
It sure wasn't. I wanted to talk about, you sort of briefly just talked about materiality, but I felt like starting with, you showed that self-portrait with the Sports Illustrated magazine, and then got into the Bikini Girls, and I feel like starting with the Bikini Girls, there was such, like, a drastic level of confidence in the way that you're handling the painting those. And I was just like, where did that come from? Because that was, like, same year, right?
That's like 2015 or 2016. You know, I think that jump comes frankly from, I've been incredibly lucky and privileged in my life to be exposed to a lot of great artwork. The first slide that I show where I'm 17 standing next to that Constance painting is because when I was 17, I went to Amsterdam with my dad. My family's, like, very Dutch. They run a tulip bulb company. But so, you know, like, not every 17-year-old gets to go to the Stedelijk Museum. So I want to just sort of acknowledge that I've been very privileged to be exposed to great work in person and great museums and collections. Yeah, and I think, like, when I went to study in Florence in my junior year of college, of undergrad. And I think, you know, I took high Renaissance art history classes, I took fresco painting classes. I think by then, frankly, like, my skill with painting was pretty good, because I had taken quite a few figurative painting classes. And I think if you are trying to build skill, painting from life and figurative painting, even if that's not the work that you want to make, is a really good way to learn how to use paint, how to use color, how to use form, how to see light, and all of those things. But yeah, you know, I'm exposed to, like, this painting and all this great work, and it just came back to my studio. And so, yeah, and also, again, like, I think part of the impetus to work really repetitively is I'm sort of training my eye and my hand on a type of image that I want to make. And so, you know, I make a lot of these paintings, you know, these are probably These are a little bigger than, these might be like 20 by 24s, like a 10 by 10, 16 by 20. And then these are starting to scale, this is like a 40 by 50 and a little bigger than that. So by the time I get to these paintings, which are 4 by 6 feet and 5 by 6 and 5 by 7, which I would love to be working at this scale all the time. I really like moving at this gesture, but like, you know, I need a patron who wants to pay for stretchers that size and like a studio assistant to stretch that and like storage space for big works. Right now when I work large, I'm usually working unstretched, and then people come in and like, oh, can you stretch it? And I was like, well, no, I painted it to the edge, so you can't. It's a whole thing. But so when you talk about confidence, it's like that confidence I think comes from continuously working with the same form over and over. So like when I get most of my paintings, when I get to the painting itself, happen fairly quickly. I'm not someone who's like laboring on the canvas for a year. The year of labor comes before I get there, and all the drawings and the smaller paintings and the sketches and all that kind of stuff. So that when I get there, it's like, okay, well, I know exactly what it's gonna be because I've done, you know, all of these drawings and things.
Hi, thank you for your talk and sharing your paintings. In your work, especially the figures that resemble paper, chain, phones, the material language suggests both fragility and connectivity. How intentional is this tension between vulnerability and interdependence in your choice of paper-like phones? It's a kind of combined question. What do you see as the emotional or conceptual function of this material fragility in your paintings?
That's a great question. Yeah, material fragility. I'm a really big fan. I think I sort of mentioned this when I was talking about this work from Alder. Sorry, guys, 150 slides, a lot of slides. I tend to. I'm generally speaking not a huge fan of things that feel really polished. Like I like to feel that the hand is present, you know, it's like, why are these paintings and not prints or not photographs, and why are they not AI generated, right? It's because somebody made it. And so I think the paper, which I have to like think about more in terms of like if I'm making more of his work, like is it archival, all that kind of stuff. I appreciate the fragility inherent in the material. And I think also like this isn't something I quite talked about because I'm not really sure exactly how I'm going to talk about it conceptually yet, but you know, I am thinking a lot about connectivity, community, and like literally like really like, you know, these are characters which are holding hands with other characters because they need support, right? They need each other. And I have like I've come, especially in the last couple of years of my life, I've become very aware of the importance of friendship, the power of friendship, and the way that being part of a community can give you strength, and allow you to be vulnerable. So I do think about those things a lot, and I haven't quite figured out how to write about them. But there's a tenderness which I really appreciate, which again also goes back to like a kind of childlike way of making. That there's like a real earnestness behind the things that I make, and I would say that I'm a pretty earnest person. I don't lean cynical at all, and I think that that's definitely also present in working with the paper, and working with these sort of childlike forms.
Hi, Isabelle, thank you for your presentation. I was also struck by like your confidence, maybe at an early age, and then also you talked about, you know, having a stage of life where you question if you should even be an artist and your friends and community support you. I was wondering, like, is there an inner critic you deal with once you're in the studio? You know, asking for a friend, like, yeah, what is it? You don't have to say what that inner critic is saying, but like, how do you deal with that inner critic? Has it gone away? Do you keep it out of the studio?
Yeah, that's a big time thing, right? I think that like, that's been a big journey, as I have gotten older. I think that like, part of my like emotional origin story is like I figured out that I was gay, you know, when I was like 12 and growing up in Connecticut in the early aughts, and like gay wasn't really a part of the culture, and I think I internalized some inherent lack out of that. And so I always had this sense of like trying to make up for something, and that manifested as perfectionism, which is a plague. Perfectionism is the worst. It is the most stifling thing. It's the most paralytic thing. You know, there were years where it's like I didn't want to, if I wasn't going to make something that I thought was excellent, I didn't want to make anything at all. And you know, that's very much not conducive to creative flow, and to having a practice. I think in the last couple of years, I've been really trying to unpin, and I think that was really hard for first when I came out of school, I'm trying to unpin this idea, or like grapple with this idea that shame is a really terrible motivator, and really not conducive to creative life. So it's like, what if, like, how can I take the pressure off and maybe give myself a carrot instead of a stick and just say like, hey, you showed up today, good job. I'm still trying to figure out what discipline looks like within that and like how to maintain life and studio practice balance, without a hammer coming down. I haven't figured that out yet. You know, it's like, that's in progress and a cumulative knowledge. Yeah, I think, and I also think like I had a lot of, I almost failed out of high school. Like I had a really hard time in school, and then I got to art school and it was like, people had told me that I was a great student for the first time in my life. I was like, what are you talking about? And I was, I mean, I was just like a big nerd. I would go to the studio from like 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. Can't do that anymore because it's 30. And then I got this scholarship to Fulbright to go to grad school, and I felt a lot of pressure around that. And I think that was part of what led me to dealing with really serious depression. I had the sense of like needing to live up to some kind of expectation. And yeah, it took a lot of therapy to work through that. You know, it's like that's something that I'm just now grappling with. And I also had this really weird sense of like, oh, I'm like 21 and like I need to become like an art star. And if I don't do it right now, it's never gonna happen. It's like, let me tell you, a lot of life past 21. A lot of lifetime. And I think that like had I become, you know, I mean, I wouldn't, I don't know, like it's like had I become an art star at 22, I think that would have been a really fragile place. And I think now in my life, I have my artistic practice, but I have all these other things that fulfill me as well. And I think that that balance puts me in a much healthier place. I think that answered your question.
I thank you for everything. I have one question about a series of work. In particular, you have these the castle paintings. I think you touched on this a little bit, but there's these layers to it. There's the castle wall, and then behind is the body, and then in front are the eyes. And there's just so much there, so many different ways I can look at these. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what this means to you.
Yeah, this is an example of like an image or a vision that I think came to me in a dream and also kind of out of therapy. So I had this idea, you know, I was like dealing with this idea of maybe like an inner child being like locked in a fortress, and the fortress meaning creating safety, but it's like walls that are protective are also walls that are like limiting, and like yearning to kind of move out of this psychological space that was like protective at a certain point in my life, but then became a hindrance. So that's like kind of the deep psychoanalytic version of that. And then also, yeah, I'm interested in like this layering and transparency and depth in space, and like layering of allegory. Yeah, this is the paintings which come out of dreams or visions are harder to explain. And I'm grateful when they come. But I also, again, like it's not every day that this happens. I think there's like a certain kind of state of mind that you're in, and maybe you're a little bit more porous to like whatever the messages, the muses, that these come up. And yeah, I was really delighted with the reception of this work at the show in Philly. I had some like real old head Philly painters come in and be really psyched, which is like a huge compliment. And yeah, I mean, they're very emotional, you know, they're very much, I think part of like a way of working which requires being really present with the work in the studio means that like whatever you got that day is what's coming on the campus, you know? So it's like, this is a time in my life when I was like, really like felt like I was in a really murky place, felt like I was kind of in the clouds and like really trying to really wanting some kind of clarity and like a lot of yearning going on. And I think that that shows up in the paintings. Again, just sort of by because I was really present with them.
Oh, cool. All right.
If you guys had to do the AV, this class would never run. I'm an analog girl in a digital world. Come on.
Really awesome talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lily.
Something that really resonated with me that you said was staying fun, and I was wondering kind of how you do that, but more specifically, since you're working, a lot of it comes from drawings, and every time you show a drawing, you're like, oh, the drawings are better, which I disagree with, but like, I feel like when you're working in this way, and it's kind of similar to what I'm doing, and like, how do you, when you're working from a drawing, how do you stay on fun when you're doing the painting based on a drawing?
Yeah, I think I've loosened up a lot with my relationship between drawing and painting. I think when I was making the Bikini Girls series, it would be like I would spend a lot of time on a really robust colored pencil drawing, and then I would try to, as best as I could, to recreate it like one-to-one on a larger scale. And I think that those works are good and successful in some ways. And I think like it made sense for the way that I was making work at that time. But especially post-grad, I've really loosened up a lot with what I understand as drawing or preparatory and what I understand as painting. And like an example of that would be like this painting where, like I said, it's like I'm drawing directly on the panel, and so the drawing is the painting, you know? And like bringing in using colored pencil or drawing with like an oil stick. Or like drawing in this way where it's kind of like a sgraffito, like etching into the paint, you know? I guess it's just about a kind of like loosening of those rules, and I don't know, I think there's also like something tied to, especially with the earlier works at like a large scale that are in this abstract place where there's like a grandiosity about them. There's like a kind of importance or like a regalness almost. And I think I wanted to subvert, or like have enjoyed subverting that a little bit, and being like, well, painting doesn't have to be, and particularly like abstraction, you know, there's like a lot of abstraction which is like based in minimalism, which has this kind of like buttoned up kind of strictness to it. And I think that that is, for me, feels like performative. And I think what's more natural to me is this kind of like cheeky, humorous, whimsical, slightly silly way of working and presenting myself and making work, you know? So it's just kind of about playing around and seeing what feels authentic.
Thank you very much for the talk. So I'm kind of curious, I think that there's a, and I may be projecting a little bit here on a little, but there's like a really interesting balance that I'm curious about and that I admire in the work that you're showing, where like you're talking, it's kind of building on Lily's question, you're talking a lot about the importance of play and fun, and it seemed like there is like a lot of that coming through in the work and just sort of like intuition and exploration. But then, at least in this presentation, there was a lot of like, you know, the first photo being at the Stedelijk Museum and thinking about like Carmen Herrera, or even like you had I can't remember the artist's name or how to pronounce it, but the design for the first Soviet theater. You have that thing where you're talking about things not considered abstract, like the game boards, tiles. There's like a lot of pattern. There's like a lot of, I think, what I'm reading as sort of, you know, glyphs, iconography, like the designed. And I'm just wondering, like, what you think about that, or if it's something that you consider a lot, like when you're making work or maybe looking back at your own work, this sort of balance between, again, keeping things fun and thinking about play and exploration and sort of like maybe a more freeing approach to like painting and making work, but also
things that are planned and like this idea of sort of like visual gestalt and like symbols and shape and like things that at least for me feel almost like a more intentional like designed approach to things, you know, like it doesn't feel like that's like the work, particularly the work at the end that you were showing, like the most recent work, like it doesn't feel like designed to me, but I just like kept seeing this recurring theme. Even sorry, and last thing like that talking about Alex has.
Yeah.
And this idea that like at you know being so accomplished that like you can reduce something, there's nothing extra, you know, which to me is like again probably just where I'm coming from, like a very much like the ideal of like the designed object.
Yeah, lots to work with there. I think it is something that I kind of wanted to mention during my talks, like in one of my first contemporary art history classes, when I was an undergrad, Jim Condren actually was a teacher of that class who's come here for studio visits, and he talked about when you look at art, you break it down into content and form, right? Content being like, what is the work on about? What are you trying to say? What's the why? And form is like how you're executing that thing. And I think what has been helpful to me in maintaining a practice is like sometimes I'm thinking a lot about the content and sometimes I'm thinking a lot about the form. And you know, I started with those works that deal very in a kind of very literal way with questions of objectification because I think that does ground practice. But it's also like part of a greater tapestry. But also on top of that, I'm just like a complete nerd and lover of art history and color and form. I'm trying to think about the other parts of your questions. Like, I don't really think about design too much. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer the rest of the question. I don't know if that was helpful.
Okay, yeah, it's pretty broad.
Hi Isabelle, thank you so much for your presentation. I feel like I'm really privileged to, you know, I guess I almost feel like I'm really privileged to witness like a snippet of your metamorphosis of your, you know, like into your from young adulthood to, you know, like more of like a matured, at peace with yourself version of you, which I really like. I really appreciate your, you know, like the rawness and sincerity. So I guess my question would be, although you sort of mentioned that you never aim to show, you know, like push for the best painting, but I guess I'm always curious about, like what piece or maybe like what series or what bodies of work do you think is, your best piece that represent your highest artistic accomplishments, or, what are your most protective work, what are the works that you feel like you cherish the most, you feel like you are, you know, that you pour your entire heart into? I'm really curious about that. Thank you.
That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, like I think this is my most recent best piece because again, it's like a mode of working where I just allowed the work to kind of show me where it wanted to go, and I followed that, and like I really have a lot of appreciation for that present sense of being present and intuition. You know, like I think like this little thing is like something that I love very dearly, and I don't necessarily think it's a big best work. It's a little thing that happened in the studio, but it's very near and dear to my heart. You know, like I don't know, like I think that, you know, it's interesting. It's like the work, like these works that I'm making certainly feel very impressive. And I'd like to be working at this scale again, and probably I'm making some fear-based excuses as to why I'm not doing that. But also like logistically, it's not easy to do and not easy to store. I don't know, you know, and it's like the work, like this work that I was making, I think was really important to make at the time. And it's also okay to like make work and to be like, great, maybe I'm not a filmmaker and like I don't really want to have to deal with that again. I guess this is not exactly answering your question, but I think something else I've been thinking about a lot lately is like time spent figuring things out is not time wasted, right? Like, and you have to like you have to fuck around and find out. You have to see it through. You have to make it and like let it be its own thing and let it leave the studio and like. And then you can reflect. You know, as someone who like I have a history of I grew up very cerebral and did a lot of thinking and ruminating and perseverating. And as I get older, I'm leaning more into feeling and being porous and all of those things. And then I think afterwards. Like I think it's yeah, I don't know. And it's really hard, like the idea of like what is your best. I mean, I remember telling after I finished this painting, I remember I told my teacher Karen Case, I was like, that's the best painting I've ever made. I'm never gonna make another painting that's that good. And I still love that painting. I know a lot of artists who like really don't like their earlier work, and like I have some of my earlier work up in my apartment, and I don't feel bad about it because I'm also like somebody else made that at a certain point because I was a different person when I made that. So I kind of can allow myself some leeway. Yeah, so I guess I'll just say like I would like to kind of reach a certain level of like I'm actually very comfortable painting in large scale and like there's something that feels really gluttonous and maximalist about that. And I'd like to kind of spread my wings and do that. But that requires a lot of time in the studio. And like to me, it's really hard to work on that scale coming off of a day of doing something else. You know, I do a lot of pussyfooting around in the studio where I'm like, I'm not quite ready to do it. So I'm gonna do this other thing over here. Like I think there's a thing called like productive procrastination where it's like, oh, I'm gonna ignore doing this work that I don't want to do and I'm gonna go over here. But I feel aware of that fear and I feel like I'm coming to a place where I'm gonna be ready to like go all in and really make that next work. But yeah, I stand by my thought that like the thing that you think is the best thing you've ever made in your studio right now in 6 months, you shouldn't feel like that. Like you will have made the next best thing.
Hi Isabel, great talk. So my question is kind of echoing both the questions about play and the question about your work being nestled in language. I guess I'm wondering, do you write about your work? And when I say write about your work, I don't mean like in the academic sense. I mean like, do your girls have stories? And we talk a lot about sketching and drawing. Do you also like write about your ideas? And how do you incorporate play into the language?
Yeah, I always have a red notebook on me, and I'm always scribbling and writing, and I think it would be great if I kind of gave myself the prompt or the time to say it's like, okay, for every girl, each one can have a story and like write those stories. That has not happened yet, but I think that would be a really nice exercise. Also, like, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I had a conversation with my dad. He was like, "Have you ever gone to business school?" It's like, what in the last 30 years of choices made me think that I want to go to business school? But it really kind of like gave me this push to be like, if I don't have the resources to like really be an artist, then like I don't know who else does. Like I have been living in New York for 5 years. All my friends are artists and writers and photographers and musicians, and like I'm very much entrenched in the world. And so at that time I started to like revive my applications sheet, which is like has all these residencies and grants that you can apply for and the dates that they're due. And so I started to write a lot more about my work. I also have a working artist statement doc that goes back to 2016. So like every iteration of my artist statement exists there. And boy, it was a lot of stuff in there. I was going down a lot of rabbit holes. But it's really great to have. We had Turquoise Dyson here a couple of years ago, and she talked about the importance of keeping an archive of your work. And like the reason why I could show all of you so many of these references is because I like posted them on my Instagram or I wrote them down or they're in an artist statement or whatever. And that's really valuable. Yeah, I think writing about the work is really helpful to help you understand it and to flesh out the world. And I love to write and I really struggle to edit. So it's also really helpful to have friends who can help you with that.
Hey, I was curious as like someone who's bounced around the East Coast a bunch, like, and also really values a sense of community. Did it feel like an inevitability that you had to come here, especially considering that you still like participate to some extent in what's going on in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I grew up like an hour outside the city, very different cultural space, very homogenous. And I was like really alternative growing up in Connecticut. And then I went to art school in Baltimore and everyone was like, oh, you're from Connecticut. And I was like, what do you mean? So you know, what I'm talking about. So I went to school in Baltimore and then it was in Philly. And there was like a brief moment where I was like, maybe I'll stay in Philly. And I was like, no, I also, a lot of my friends had moved to New York after undergrad, so I had some friends here already. And I had, when I was in undergrad, I didn't talk about this, but I used to work, I was the first intern at Fortnite Institute, which is a gallery run by Fabiola Landra and Jane Harmon, two incredibly smart women and mentors and dear friends. And so I got to see like women being really badass in the art world space. They ran a small gallery in the East Village for like 8-9 years. They had a really interesting point of view. So I was like, would commute into the city to like intern with, to basically gallery sit with them over the summers when I was in college. And yeah, so I think I always knew I was going to come back here. And it took me about 4 years of living in New York to really feel like I had community. Like I had people that I knew when I moved here, but I had branched out and made new friends. And it's like on any given week, it's like I'm going to the transsexual poetry night, and then I'm going to this talking and screening at the Museum of Moving Image, and then I'm going to the art opening, and then I'm going to like the disco party that's at the Coney Island bumper cars. Like that stuff takes a long time to feel settled in it. And my feeling about New York is if you are not taking advantage of all of the culture that you have access to living here, then you shouldn't live here. And it's not meant to be like a dig, but like if you come home from work or wherever you are during the day and you just need to go straight home, then like definitely don't live here because the rent is too damn high for the amount of space that you have. Like I have 2 roommates, you know what I'm saying? I live in Ridgewood, love it. But you know, I think like part of justifying living in New York is taking advantage of all the culture that you have access to. And part of making living in New York possible is having like a network of friends and people that you can check in with. Because everybody else is struggling too.
Hi, Isabelle.
How
so wise. Okay, so okay, almost forgot my question. So I noticed that there's only 2 works where you appear very clearly, which is the self-portrait with the calendar girl on the back, and then the video piece about your grandmother. And you really this is the only piece that you talk about as being a self-portrait. Although a lot of your work seems to be about, you know, your experiences, and then, you know, there's these bodies from perspectives that looks like you're looking down on yourself. And I'm just wondering if you think of any of your work other than the calendar girl one as, you know, self-portraits, or are they different versions of yourself, or are they just other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'll just touch on this work. I think here I was playing in the realm of performance, and so I felt like I was kind of embodying the ghost of my grandmother. I was sort of performing as this person that I never met, so I didn't have direct memory of, that I was like doing my best to kind of create the world that she lives in. And I did like that, and I dare say I think I would be a good actress. And I also can sing and dance, so it's like a lot of threats here. But then, when we get to this work, like this is very much a reflection of the state of being that I was in, like this, a lot of these, like, this is a reflection of the state of being. I think some of these pieces I feel like are actually not portraits of people because they're paintings of masks or faces. So there's like a non-sentience that's going on here. And I think when we get to these works, where it's sort of like we're in this character, I think that I like the idea that this could be like an avatar of my experience, but that there gets to be like universality in there. I was thinking I have like a painted self-portrait from college that's up in my parents' house. I was there this weekend. I haven't made a self-portrait in a really long time, and I wonder what that would look like. And I'm also always like flirting with like, what if I just did make a figurative painting? but not yet. And also like, I don't know if that's what I want, I'll make one, I had a friend be like, why don't you do that? Not everyone can do that. I'm like, okay, but not everyone can put this triangle into this rectangle in this way, so. And I'm so appreciative of like, you know, I think we talk a lot about this in this class, in this program, this idea of like personal to universal and like where the kind of oscillation between those things, and I appreciate the like room for production that these provide. I think that while I wouldn't say that like these are like, I'm not like, oh, that's me on this day, like again, there's a lot of like feeling and a lot of like I care very deeply about these girls, you know, like these are like tender characters and like representations of like girlhood as an experience and like, you know, like, which is such a scary world to live in and sometimes feels like it's full of traps, but then there also can be like so much liberation there, you know, like, so I think there's some self in that way, even if it's not a direct portrait.
Hi Isabel, thank you so much. Yeah, I was gonna say that I was very encouraged by hearing about your journey. And I feel very inspired. Like, I was curious about what is your approach to titling your work? And do you have any examples of some titles that you really like of your own work?
Yeah, you love the fact that I gave up on captions. 150 slides. I was like looking at friends who was talking, I was like, oh, you only did captions for not your work? Genius. So it saved me. But I do believe in titles and titling. I think again, like many people have mentioned, like language is very important in my practice. Hold on, I'm gonna pull up. I got a bunch of Google Sheets, which you guys, maybe I'll share some screenshots because I think they're helpful. One of them, like I said, is the applications sheet that I have. And another one is a sheet that I titled Works Archive Studio Inventory because I forgot which of those two things I titled it. So I just put them both in there. So when I don't remember, I can just look it up. But you can't see this, but it has like a tiny thumbnail of the painting and then the title, the year, the medium, and dimensions, and then like retail price, which that's another conversation. And like notes, like where is it right now? So I recommend doing that. It's really helpful to have, especially when you're like applying for things consistently. Then it's like, oh, I don't have to remember how big is that thing. Anyway, but so some painting titles, like recently, I just started calling these the paper doll chain paintings. So like that is a series of it's like paper doll chain painting 1, red field, and then 2, sage on mauve field, and then you know 3, paint spraying purple. Some of these earlier ones I refer to as tiny dancer paintings, sort of Elton John, but not exactly. Some people are like, why are they dancers if they're not moving? It's like, don't worry about it. It's because I'm a dancer, you know, and also like ballerinas, you know, the Bauhaus Ballet. This one's Dancers for La Discotheque, because I thought about like the lighting at this really cool party that I went to and like seeing dancers in the lights. More titles. Some of the titles for the work that was in the Automat show is like, this one is called In the Tallest Tower and Highest Tower and the Tallest Thing, which is actually a line from Shrek. Which I did not realize because it's become so part of the culture that like I thought that was just like a stock beginning of a fairy tale line, which is you gotta interrogate. My friend told me that she was like, "Just did you know that that's from Shrek?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" You know, this one's like Miss Mary Mack, so like a reference to children's rhyme, Miss Mary Mack all dressed in black. But I'm big into the parentheses. I like an M dash SUNY. So it's Miss Mary Mack parentheses moon over water. Definitely think about turquoise dice in there. Just think about any of the titles. And like a lot of like she's big red. I don't know. This is like one of these is like blondie, you know. What was the question related to the titling? I can't remember.
No, I was just wondering, like, I'm curious about your approach in general to titling your work. Your favorite, like, if you have like a very good one to this.
My approach is like, what am I calling it in the studio? And usually I try to just title it based off of that. Like, you know, like, so like, yeah, this one becomes just Big Red because like that's what I'm calling her in the studio. And this one is Girls Bearing the Rectangle, parentheses, Sisyphean Quest. Yeah, she's highbrow. You know, like she's reading. Do I have anything else to say about that? Yeah, that's what I gotta say about that. Oh, we got one in the back. All right, maybe that's the last one. I don't know. How do you feel, Mark? Or not? Anyone else? Okay.
Oh.
Make sure that green light's on.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Thank you as well for this amazing presentation. It's very thorough and I really appreciate also sharing a lot of things about studio life and balancing that with a job. I feel like that's something that everyone is really concerned about. And my question for you is that it seems, if it's possible, can we go back to the painting where you had the triangular or like that subject figure that had the space of the glass field?
This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, it seems like this figure is holding a space within its body and the figure is also within a space. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the relationship between the figure holding the space within and the figure being in the space itself.
Or yeah, I kind of, yeah, like I like this idea, you know, the earlier paintings I talked about his body as landscape. And I like the idea that these characters could be situated within a landscape. So I'm a big fan of like a little horizon line, or some of my other paintings have little moons to kind of suggest scale and vastness. I like that's something I really appreciate about landscape in general, is like this idea of scale and vastness, and also that she might be like a mountain or a monolith or a really big rock in and of herself. This idea that like there can be depth or weight or like heft to a form. Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's like, I think I was thinking a lot about like figure ground relationship and kind of the push and pull of that in more of these works, where it's like the figures kind of come in and out of the field, like these works. And I think and that's also, I think, kind of coming back up in the work I'm making now, like in these, where it's like there's a push and pull between the figure and the ground. I think that that's maybe the most fruitful or interesting, and like where I want to lean. I like making these ones as well, where it's like it's a very specific, it's a shape that has its own form, and it is like there's a flatness to it. But I think like in terms of like painting, and like painting capital P, I think that like the push and pull becomes very interesting, and I want to think about that more moving forward. Thank you. That doesn't have to be the last one, but Bueller.
Right.
All right.